Matilda Chandler had exactly $47, a carpet bag held together with a leather strap borrowed from a broken bridle, and an advertisement torn from the back pages of the Cincinnati Enquirer that read, "Wanted companion for elderly woman of good standing, residing in Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory. Room, board, and modest wage provided. Must be of sound character and willing constitution. Reply to Mrs. Henrietta Yates, General Delivery, Dusty Creek." She had replied, been accepted, and boarded the westbound train out of Cincinnati on a Tuesday morning in April of 1882, with the particular kind of determination that belongs only to women who have exhausted every other option available to them. Matilda was 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died of consumption 2 winters prior, and a mother who had remarried a man named Gerald Prout with small eyes and a smaller soul. Gerald had made it abundantly clear that a grown stepdaughter with opinions and independent thinking was not an asset to his household. Matilda had made it equally clear. On the morning she packed her carpet bag and walked to the train station without saying goodbye, that she had no intention of remaining where she was not wanted. The train ride west was 3 days of coal smoke, hard benches, and the company of strangers who ranged from fascinating to deeply suspicious. She passed through Missouri and into the dusty red territories beyond, watching the world outside the window transform from green rolling hills into something vast and untamed and achingly beautiful in a way she had no words for yet. The sky out here was a different sky entirely. It was wider somehow, as though the earth had simply stepped back to give it room. She arrived in Dusty Creek on a Friday afternoon in late April, stepping off the stagecoach that had carried her the final leg from Santa Fe into a town that smelled of horse and dry earth and something faintly like possibility. Dusty Creek was not a large town. It had a main street with a general store, a hotel of middling respectability, a saloon with a hand-painted sign that read, "The Copper Spur," a blacksmith, a church with a bell that one of the locals would later tell her hadn't rung properly since the clapper broke in 1879, and a scattering of houses and outbuildings that radiated outward from that central spine like spokes on a wheel that had seen better days. A boy of perhaps 12 was sitting on the steps of the general store, and Matilda approached him with her carpet bag in hand. "I am looking for the Yates Ranch," she said. "Can you point me in the right direction?" The boy looked her up and down with the frank appraisal that children apply to strangers. "You the companion lady?" he asked. "I am. Old Mrs. Yates sent her grandson in to fetch you," the boy said, jerking his thumb down the street. "He's over at the livery, big fella, hard to miss." The livery was 2 buildings down, and Matilda walked toward it with her bag pulling at her arm and the April sun pressing warm against the dark wool of her traveling dress. She had not thought much about what the grandson would be like. The advertisement had said nothing about him. She had constructed in her mind, without particularly meaning to, a vague image of some middle-aged rancher with a wife and several children, the sort of person who would load her and her bag into a wagon with minimal conversation and deliver her to his grandmother like a piece of furniture. What she found instead was a man who stood at the entrance of the livery with his hat pushed back on his head, talking to the stableman with his arms crossed over his chest, and who turned to look at her when she approached with a directness that made her straighten her spine reflexively. He was perhaps 28, with the kind of lean, sun-weathered look that came from years spent outdoors in a climate that did not negotiate. His hair was dark brown under the hat's shadow, his jaw carried a few days of stubble, and his eyes, when they settled on her, were a clear, particular shade of gray that she would later decide looked exactly like the sky before a storm rolls in from the mountains. He was, she thought in the flat and unsentimental portion of her mind, extremely handsome. She noted this the way she might note that the afternoon sky was a lovely shade of blue as a fact, without particular attachment to what it meant. "Miss Chandler," he said. "That's right," she said. "And you are?" "Vernon Yates," he said, and extended a hand. His grip was firm and brief and entirely correct. "My grandmother sent me. She would have come herself, but her hip's been giving her trouble this week. The wagon's just around back. Can I take your bag?" "Thank you," she said, and handed it over. He took it with the easy strength of a man to whom physical labor was simply the texture of daily life, and she followed him around the side of the livery to where a wagon stood hitched to a sturdy roan horse, loaded with supplies from the general store. The ride out to the ranch was 40 minutes along a road that was more suggestion than certainty, through land that opened up around them in every direction into rolling grassland and the red-brown shoulders of distant mesas, with the mountains on the western horizon still wearing their winter white. Vernon Yates was not an excessive talker, but he was not rude. He answered her questions about the ranch. It ran cattle, about 400 head, employed 6 permanent hands and hired additional help during roundup, had been in the Yates family since his grandfather had homesteaded the land in 1859, in clear, measured sentences that told her he was accustomed to being precise. She asked about Mrs. Yates, and something in his expression shifted, though he kept his eyes on the road. "She's 71, he said, sharp as a tack in her mind, and she'd tell you so herself in stronger terms. But she had a fall last November and the hip never healed quite right, and the doctor in Santa Fe told her she needed to take it easier. She doesn't agree with that assessment, but she's willing to have some company. She gets lonely, I think, though she'd never say so." "What happened to her husband?" Matilda asked. "My grandfather passed in 1874, Vernon said. "My parents died when I was 16. Fever took them both within a week of each other. It was just me and Grandma Henrietta after that." He said it simply, without self-pity, the way people say things they have long since absorbed into the ordinary fabric of who they are. Matilda looked at the side of his face and felt something quiet and old inside her recognize something quiet and old inside him. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. He glanced at her briefly. "Thank you," he said. They did not speak again for a little while after that, and the silence was not uncomfortable. The Yates Ranch house was a long, low adobe structure that sat on a rise overlooking a creek that gave the town its name, shaded on the south side by 3 ancient cottonwood trees. There were corrals behind it, a bunkhouse off to the left, a barn and several outbuildings, and the particular well-maintained look of a property that was worked rather than merely owned. Chickens moved purposefully through the yard. A dog of uncertain heritage and cheerful disposition came bounding out to meet the wagon. Standing on the porch, leaning on a carved wooden cane but standing very straight regardless, was Henrietta Yates. She was a small woman who had once been taller, and now made no apologies for the slight curve that age had introduced to her spine. Her white hair was pinned severely. Her eyes were a dark, lively brown, and her expression as she watched Matilda climb down from the wagon was one of frank and immediate assessment. "So you're the Chandler girl," she said when Matilda reached the porch steps. "Yes, ma'am," Matilda said. "Matilda Chandler. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Yates." "It is a pleasure to meet me," Henrietta agreed without a trace of irony. "Come inside. You look like you could use a meal and a chair that isn't moving." "Vernon, get her bag." "Already have it, Grandma," Vernon said from behind Matilda. "Good boy," Henrietta said, and turned and went inside, thumping her cane against the plank floor. Matilda looked back at Vernon. Something that might have been the ancestor of a smile crossed his face. "She's exactly what she appears to be," he said quietly. "No more, no less. You'll find that's refreshing after a while." "I already do," Matilda said, and meant that too. The interior of the ranch house was well appointed by the standards of the territory, which was to say it had plank floors, real glass windows, a large fireplace built from river stone, furniture that had been hauled across considerable distances at considerable expense, and bookshelves that surprised Matilda completely. She stopped and stared at them, 2 large shelves taking up most of one wall, filled with volumes that ranged from agricultural texts to novels to what appeared to be a complete set of Shakespeare. "My late husband was a great reader," Henrietta said, from where she had settled into a high-backed chair near the fireplace. "I continue the tradition. Can you read, Miss Chandler?" "My father was a schoolteacher," Matilda said. "I've read most of what's on those shelves, I expect." Henrietta's eyes lit with something that was not quite approval but was clearly the precursor to it. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me about your father." So Matilda sat and she told Mrs. Yates about her father, Thomas Chandler, who had taught school in Cincinnati for 22 years and read aloud every evening after supper, and believed with genuine conviction that there was no human problem that could not be improved, if not solved, by the careful application of education and patience. She told her about her mother, who had been gentle and musical, and who had perhaps needed a steadier sort of man than Thomas Chandler, and about the remarriage to Gerald Prout, and about the advertisement in the back of the Enquirer and the train westward. She told it plainly and without embellishment, because Henrietta Yates had the kind of face that would have received embellishment poorly. Vernon came and went during this conversation, bringing coffee and then disappearing to attend to whatever tasks the afternoon required of him, and Matilda was aware of his presence in the room with a peripheral attention she did not entirely understand. "You'll do," Henrietta said, when Matilda had finished. It was the highest form of praise the old woman apparently offered. "Your room is down the hall. My girl Rosa does the cooking and heavy cleaning. Your job is to read to me in the evenings, accompany me on short walks when the hip permits, help me with my correspondence, and refrain from being insipid. Can you manage all of that?" "I believe so," Matilda said. "Good," Henrietta said. "Supper is at 6. The first weeks at the Yates ranch settled into a routine that was, for Matilda, quietly restorative in ways she had not anticipated needing. She had not realized how brittle she had become in her father's house after his death, and then in Gerald Prout's house after her mother's remarriage, constantly angled and braced against some fresh, small cruelty. Here there was nothing to brace against. The work was real and satisfying. Henrietta was demanding but entirely fair, and the land itself seemed to breathe differently than anything she had known before, wide and dry and honest. She read to Henrietta in the evenings, and Henrietta had sharp opinions about everything she read and was not reluctant to share them. She helped with correspondence, which turned out to be considerable. Henrietta Yates maintained active letters with people across 4 territories, 2 of them being local politicians whose agricultural policies she found wanting and had been telling so in careful, devastating prose for a decade. She walked with Henrietta along the creek on the better afternoons, slow, deliberate walks with the cane tapping the ground and the old woman narrating the history of every rock and plant and feature of the land, with the authority of someone who had watched it all accumulate over more than 30 years. And she saw Vernon Yates every day. He was up before dawn and worked until dark, which was simply the nature of the life, but he was at breakfast and at supper, and sometimes in the evenings he would come into the main room to look over the account books or to talk with Henrietta about the business of the ranch. He was always courteous to Matilda, always respectful, and always, she noticed, careful to maintain a proper distance. He treated her like a guest, which she was, and like an employee, which she also was, and with a kind of quiet consideration that she found, over time, far more affecting than if he had tried to charm her. Because he did not try to charm her. He simply was who he was, with no apparent performance involved, and that was harder to be indifferent to than any amount of deliberate charm would have been. She noticed things about him in the gradual accumulating way you notice things when you live alongside someone. She noticed that he read too, and not just agricultural texts. She found him once on the porch in the last of the evening light with a battered copy of The Count of Monte Cristo that was missing its back cover, and when she commented on it, he said simply that he had been reading it every couple of years since he was 15 and it still held up, and looked at her with a directness that made her drop her eyes to the porch railing. She noticed that he was good to the men who worked for him. Not soft, the ranch was run with clear expectations and clear consequences, but fair and attentive in a way that made her think he knew each of them as individuals rather than as labor. There was a hand named Domingo who was 20 and a little homesick for the family he'd left in Albuquerque, and she watched Vernon one afternoon stop everything he was doing to spend 20 minutes talking to the boy about nothing in particular, and understood that he had noticed the same homesickness and was, in his way, doing something about it. She noticed that when Henrietta had a bad day with the hip and was short-tempered and difficult, Vernon absorbed it without resentment and found small ways to make the evening easier. A cup of tea at the right moment, a particularly funny story from one of the hands to make the old woman laugh. He loved his grandmother with the whole and uncomplicated love of someone who understood exactly what she was worth and had no intention of ever taking it for granted. She noticed, and she told herself that noticing was all it was, and she believed herself for a little while. It was at the end of May, about 5 weeks after her arrival, that the first real conversation happened. She had gone out to sit on the porch in the late evening after Henrietta was settled for the night, because the sky in New Mexico territory in late May was a thing she still could not take for granted, black and enormous, and blazing with stars in a way that no city sky had ever prepared her for. She was sitting in the cane chair at the far end of the porch looking up when she heard the screen door and Vernon came out. He paused when he saw her, and she thought for a moment he might go back inside, but he came and stood at the porch railing instead, looking up at the same sky. "I used to think when I was a boy," he said without preamble, "that the stars out here were different stars than the ones people saw back east. Not the same sky, just spread wider. I thought we had more of them." "In a way you do," she said. "No lamplight to drown them out." He glanced at her sidelong. "Is that what it is?" "That is absolutely what it is," she said. "Cincinnati had stars too. I just couldn't see them." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Cincinnati?" Matilda thought about it honestly. "I miss my father," she said. "I miss the version of that house that existed when he was alive. I don't miss the city itself particularly, and I don't miss what it became after. After your mother's remarriage," he said. "You remember." "I pay attention," he said simply. There was a pause. Below them the creek made its small sound in the darkness, and somewhere out in the pasture a horse moved. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Going somewhere else? There are other places to run cattle." "No," he said, and there was nothing uncertain about it. "This is my grandmother's land. My grandfather built this house. I grew up here. There's nowhere else I'd rather be." "That's not nothing," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He stood at the railing for a few more minutes, and she sat in her chair, and they said nothing else. And when he eventually said good night and went inside, she remained for a long time looking at the stars and trying to identify, with the precision her father had always encouraged in her, what exactly was happening inside her chest. She could not immediately identify it, but she recognized it. She had read enough novels to have a general sense of the shape of it, even if she had never personally experienced it before. She was 24 years old and had spent most of her adult life being practical, and practical women did not fall in love with their employers' grandsons simply because those grandsons had storm-gray eyes and remembered things you said, and read Alexander Dumas on the front porch in the evening light. She put the feeling away carefully and went to bed. The problem, she would discover over the following weeks, was that feelings do not particularly care whether you put them away. They simply continue to exist in whatever corner you have assigned them to and expand steadily until the corner is insufficient. June came in hot and fragrant and full of activity on the ranch. Roundup had happened in the spring, and now the work was the constant vigilance of maintaining 400 cattle across a large range, checking water sources, managing the grazing rotation, watching for injury and illness, dealing with the occasional predator that came down from the mountains. Matilda saw less of Vernon in the days because the work pulled him farther afield, but she saw him at meals, and occasionally in the evenings, and she was learning, unwillingly, to read the particular quality of his tiredness and the particular quality of his rare moments of satisfaction, the way you learn the weather signs of a landscape you have come to inhabit. Henrietta, she was discovering, was watching all of this with considerable interest. The old woman did not say anything directly, which was not her usual style. Usually Henrietta Yates said everything directly, with a clarity of expression that could be bracing or hilarious depending on your disposition. But she had a way of arranging circumstances that Matilda was only slowly recognizing for what it was. She would ask Matilda to carry a message to Vernon out at the barn. She would propose a walk along the creek at exactly the time she knew Vernon would be returning from the north pasture. She would mention at supper, with entirely innocent delivery, that Matilda had been discussing the Count of Monte Cristo with her and had some very interesting opinions about it, and then sit back and watch. "You are being very transparent," Matilda told her one afternoon, when Henrietta had just sent her to ask Vernon about something that could absolutely have waited until supper. "I am being efficient," Henrietta said without looking up from her needlework. "At my age I cannot afford to be indirect. Time is a limited commodity." "Mrs. Yates," Matilda said carefully, "I am here as your companion. I am not here to—" "Oh, I know what you are here for," Henrietta said, looking up with those sharp dark eyes. "And you are doing it admirably. I am not suggesting you neglect your duties. I am merely observing that my grandson is 30 years old and has spent those 30 years being so focused on this ranch, and on me that he has forgotten to have a life of his own, and you are the most interesting and suitable young woman who has come within a reasonable distance of this property in several years, and I see no reason to pretend I don't notice things." Matilda was quiet. "He is a good man," Henrietta said, more quietly. "A better man than most. He deserves to be happy." "I am sure he does," Matilda said. "And so do you," Henrietta said, and looked back down at her needlework and did not say anything else on the subject. The conversation sat with Matilda for days. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn over a river stone to see what lives underneath it. She was here as a companion, employed and dependent on the goodwill of this household. She was not a wealthy woman, not a woman with family connections or social standing that would make her an obvious candidate to— She stopped herself. She was being absurd. Nothing had happened. Vernon Yates had been courteous and occasionally talked to her in the evenings. That was not the foundation of anything except a pleasant working situation. But then July came, and the dance happened. There was a social gathering at the Prescott family's ranch, the next property over, a barn dance, held in midsummer every year by the Prescott family as a way of bringing together the scattered ranching families of the territory. And it was the kind of event that everyone attended because it was simply what you did when civilization was spread thin, and community was something you built deliberately or did without. Henrietta could not manage the wagon ride in the late evening, and she made this known with a dignity that only barely concealed her frustration, and she told Vernon flatly that he was to go and that he was to take Miss Chandler because the girl had been working hard and deserved an evening of something other than reading aloud and walking along the creek. "I don't wish to impose," Matilda said. "You're not imposing," Henrietta said. "Vernon needs someone to talk to who isn't a cow. Go and enjoy yourselves. Rosa will stay with me." They drove to the Prescott Ranch in the wagon as the sun went down, with the sky going through its extraordinary western performance of gold and orange and deep rose, and the air cooling from the day's heat into something soft and bearable. Matilda had put on her best dress, which was a blue-gray that approximated the color of a sage bush in winter, with a white collar and her mother's small pearl buttons at the cuffs. She had done her hair up more carefully than usual. She told herself this was simply because it was a social occasion and appropriate presentation was important. Vernon had put on a clean white shirt and a dark vest and had clearly made some effort with his hair, and she noticed this without commenting on it. The Prescott barn was strung with lanterns and full of people, and the energetic sound of a fiddle and a guitar played by men who knew exactly what a barn dance required. Matilda had not danced in over 2 years. There had been nothing to dance at in the months of her father's illness and afterward, and she had not realized until she walked into that warm, bright, music-filled barn how much she had missed the specific feeling of being in a room where people were choosing to be happy together. There were introductions to make, neighbors to meet, the social texture of a community to navigate. Vernon was known and liked here. She could see people came to him with the ease of long acquaintance. He introduced her simply. "This is Miss Chandler, my grandmother's companion," and she was taken up immediately by a cluster of women who wanted to hear about where she was from and how she found the territory, and she found herself enjoying the conversation with an ease she had forgotten she possessed. The dancing started, and partners were claimed, and she danced twice with a cheerful red-haired man named Patrick Prescott, who was the son of the host and had excellent technique and absolutely no pretension about him. Then there was a pause in the music for refreshments, and she found herself at the punch bowl standing beside Vernon, who had been dancing too. She had noticed from across the room, with what seemed like polite obligation rather than particular enthusiasm. "You dance very well," he said. "My father insisted on it," she said. "He believed dancing was a social obligation, like voting and returning borrowed books." Vernon laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and she felt something shift in her chest like a door moving on its hinges. She had heard him laugh before, but not like that, not with that complete absence of self-consciousness. "That is the best description of dancing I have ever heard," he said. "What about you?" she asked. "Did someone insist on your dancing?" "My grandmother," he said. "When I was about 14, she spent 3 weeks teaching me in the kitchen, because she said a man who couldn't dance was a man who couldn't be trusted in social situations." "Was she right?" "Probably," he said, and there was that almost smile again. The music started again, and there was a natural pause in their conversation, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and she thought very clearly, "If you do not ask me, I will be disappointed, and I will not be able to pretend that I am not." "Miss Chandler," he said, "would you do me the honor?" "I would," she said. He was a better dancer than he appeared from across the room, which was to say he was good, deliberate, and sure. And if he was not Patrick Prescott in terms of flourish, he more than compensated in solidity, in the particular quality of his attention. He danced with her like she was the only person in the room, which she did not think he intended as a statement, but which she received as one nonetheless. She was very aware of his hand at her waist and his other hand holding hers, and the lantern light made everything warm and a little unreal, and the fiddle played something that was quick and then slowed into something considerably more tender, and she did not pull away from the slower song the way she theoretically could have. "I am glad you came," he said quietly for her ear rather than the room. "Your grandmother insisted," she said. "She usually does," he said, "but I am glad regardless." The evening wound down in the gradual warm way of good gatherings, and they drove back to the ranch under stars that were even better than the ones she had seen from the porch. And they talked on the drive home, really talked. The easy-flowing kind of conversation that happens when the normal social anxieties have been dissolved by music and dancing and punch, and the lateness of the hour. She told him about things she had not meant to tell anyone, about what it had been like watching her father die, the long, slow months of it, and the specific grief of losing not just a person, but the person who had best understood you. He listened the way he did everything, with the full weight of his attention, and he told her things in return, about his parents, whom he had loved with the fierce devotion of an only child, and whom he had lost at 16 to a fever that swept through the territory and took 37 people before it was done. About the year afterward, which had been the hardest year of his life, working the ranch alongside the hands because there was nothing else to do, learning to be a man faster than he might otherwise have needed to, with Henrietta as his model and his anchor. About the ranch, which he talked about with the same love most people reserve for living things, because to him it was. "You love it," she said. "This land, I can hear it when you talk about it." "I do," he said. "I can't entirely explain it. It's not a comfortable place and it's not an easy life, but it's real. Everything out here is real." She looked at the silhouettes of the mesas in the moonlight and understood exactly what he meant. When they arrived back at the ranch, the house was quiet, Henrietta long since in bed. He helped her down from the wagon and walked her to the porch, and they stood for a moment in the way that people stand at the end of an evening, when neither of them particularly wants it to be over, and she felt the particular suspended quality of the moment like a breath held. "Thank you," she said, "for taking me. I had a very good evening." "So did I," he said, and there was something in the simple directness of it that was more than a polite response. "Good night, Miss Chandler." "Good night, Mr. Yates," she said, and went inside. She lay in the dark in her room for a long time, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, the horses moving in the corral, the far-off bark of the coyotes in the hills, and she stopped pretending to herself. She was in love with Vernon Yates. She was thoroughly, inconveniently, and entirely in love with him. The only question was what, if anything, she was going to do about it, and the answer to that question, as a woman in her position, was almost certainly nothing. It was not her place to declare herself. It was not her place to push or hope or maneuver. It was, she decided, her grandmother's place, and Henrietta Yates apparently agreed. The following morning, Henrietta said nothing about the dance directly, but she watched Matilda over breakfast with an expression of profound satisfaction, and when Vernon came in from the early chores and poured himself coffee and glanced at Matilda across the table in a way that was not quite casual, the old woman's expression intensified into something that was very nearly smug. "Vernon," she said, "there is a problem with the fence along the south pasture." "I'll look at it this afternoon," he said. "Miss Chandler could go with you," Henrietta said. "She's been indoors too long. The fresh air would do her good." "Mrs. Yates," Matilda said, "I was just outside this morning for our walk." "A different kind of outside," Henrietta said serenely. "Vernon," he looked at Matilda, and there was something in his face that she could not immediately name, but that made her pulse do something irregular. "If Miss Chandler would like to," he said. She would like to, and this was the problem, and they both knew it, and so she went. The south pasture was a mile from the house, accessible by a track that wound through scrubby juniper and over a dry wash that had water in it only when the rains came. The fence problem turned out to be 3 broken posts and a section of wire that something, probably cattle, Vernon thought, had pushed through from the other side. He had brought tools and worked methodically, and she sat on a flat boulder nearby and watched him work and tried to have a sensible internal conversation with herself. "Can I help?" she asked after a while. He looked up. "Do you know how to fix fence?" "No," she said, "but I could learn." He considered her for a moment, and then he said, "All right," and showed her, patiently and without condescension, how to pull wire taut and how to wrap it around the post, and how to set a replacement post when the old one had rotted at the base. She was not very good at it, and she did not pretend to be, but she worked at it with genuine attention, and at some point they were standing very close together over a section of wire, and she was aware of the warmth of him beside her and the smell of the sun-warmed earth and the sound of the grasshoppers in the brush, and it was all very specific and very real and very much happening. "Like this?" she asked about the wire. "Just about," he said. "Closer here." He adjusted her hands, and the contact was brief and deliberate and entirely correct, and he stepped back immediately. But the air had changed quality in a way that was not her imagination. They worked in silence for a little while longer, and then he said, without looking at her, "Miss Chandler." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly because I don't know another way." She looked up at him. He met her eyes. "I have been," he paused, choosing words with the same care he chose fence posts. "I have been thinking a great deal about you since you arrived. I am aware that your situation here is a particular one, and I would not for anything in the world make you feel that your position depends on Vernon," she said, and the use of his first name stopped him entirely. They had been very correct about names until now. He looked at her steadily. "I would prefer you just said the thing," she said, plainly, "as you intended." He took a breath. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly, with the intention of understanding whether what I am feeling is what I believe it to be, if that is something you would welcome." She felt the warmth of it move through her like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. She looked at him. This man who worked this land with his whole self, who loved his grandmother without embarrassment, who read Dumas on the porch in the evening and fixed fence and danced like he was paying full attention, who said things plainly when he said them at all. "It is something I would welcome," she said. The slow unfolding of a courtship in the summer of 1882 in Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, had its own particular texture that was nothing like what Matilda had read in novels and better. There were no drawing rooms or calling cards, no chaperones hovering in parlors. There was the land itself, vast and indifferent and magnificent, and two people finding each occasion to know each other a little more completely. He brought her wildflowers once, a small bunch of the yellow ones that grew along the creek, presented with a gruffness that suggested he had thought about it considerably more than he wanted to appear, and she put them in a jar of water on the windowsill of her room and looked at them every morning for the week they lasted. She wrote him a letter, an actual letter, because it seemed to her the right form for certain things, telling him about a dream she'd had about the ranch, something she could not have explained if asked to, but which seemed exactly right. He kept it. She did not know this until much later, but she found it pressed inside his copy of Monte Cristo when she was dusting the bookshelves, and by then she understood everything perfectly. They talked. They talked in a way she had not talked to anyone since her father, with the particular freedom of two people who have independently reached a conclusion that the other can be trusted with honesty. He told her about a girl he had known 5 years ago, a rancher's daughter from further east, who had decided after 2 months of corresponding that New Mexico Territory was too far from everything she loved, and he had understood her and been sad about it in the measured way of a man who was accustomed to loss. She told him about the young men she had known in Cincinnati, none of them particularly vivid in her memory, none of them having made any impression that would qualify as formative, and he listened with that full attention that she had come to think of as entirely his own, a quality she had not encountered before in quite that form. Henrietta watched all of this and kept her counsel, with a restraint that cost her visibly. She was not precisely subtle. She had arranged that they sit together at supper. She had produced reasons for them to be in proximity on a nearly daily basis. She had made exactly one pointed comment to Matilda about the importance of not letting good things pass you by, delivered with the brevity of someone who trusts the other person to fill in the rest. But she did not interfere, and she did not push, and Matilda understood that this too was a form of love. August arrived, ferociously hot in the days and tender in the evenings, and with it came a complication. His name was Carter Blaine, and he arrived on a Wednesday with a letter of introduction from a cattle broker in Santa Fe and a proposal to buy the Yates ranch. He was about 40, well-dressed by territory standards, with a smooth manner and the particular breed of confidence that money provides. He sat in Henrietta's parlor and presented his offer, which was fair and possibly even slightly generous, and laid out his reasons for wanting the property, which centered on the water rights. The creek that ran through the Yates land was one of the more reliable water sources in the area, and whoever controlled it had an advantage in grazing. Henrietta heard him out completely, which was her way, and then said no. Carter Blaine had apparently not been prepared for this response. He adjusted his approach and spoke about the financial security such a sale would provide, the difficulty of running a ranch without a husband, the various practical advantages. "I have been running this ranch without a husband since 1874, Henrietta said. "My grandson manages the operations admirably. Thank you for your offer, Mr. Blaine." The answer is no. He left, but he came back 2 days later and spoke this time to Vernon directly, out at the barn, a conversation that Matilda did not witness, but that Vernon described to her afterward with the flat economy of someone who is managing a considerable amount of controlled irritation. He made the same offer, Vernon said. I told him no. And, she said, because there was clearly more. He suggested that the property would be worth more to him than it is to a grandson who could sell it and be free to do other things. Vernon was looking out at the pasture. I told him this was my grandmother's home and that the water in that creek was as much a part of this land as the grass and the dirt and the house sitting on it, and that it was not for sale. Good, Matilda said, with a firmness that surprised her a little. He looked at her. You feel strongly about it, he said. Your grandmother's home is her home, she said. Some things are not about money. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, and then he said quietly, No. They're not. Carter Blaine came a third time, a week later, and this time he spoke to Henrietta again, and the conversation grew sharper. He intimated that the water rights issue might become a legal matter, that he had the resources to pursue it through the territorial courts, that the Yates position might be less secure than they believed. Henrietta listened to this with an expression of such perfectly contained fury that Matilda, sitting nearby in her role as companion, felt a secondary chill from the temperature of it. Mr. Blaine, Henrietta said when he had finished, my husband established our water rights under territorial law when this land was homesteaded in 1859. Those rights are documented, recorded, and unassailable. If you wish to spend your money on lawyers to discover this fact, you are welcome to do so. I would suggest instead that you direct that money toward finding land that is actually available for purchase. This property is not, and will not be. Now please get off my porch. He left, and this time he did not come back. Word through the ranching community was that he had purchased a smaller property further south, and the relief at the Yates ranch was palpable, though Henrietta accepted the resolution with the equanimity of someone who had never doubted the outcome. What the episode did, among other things, was crystallize something for Matilda that had been forming slowly over the weeks. She loved this place. She had not expected to, had not come west with any intention beyond finding a livable situation, but somewhere in the process of walking that land and watching it across the different hours of the day, and knowing the names of things, the creek, the mesas, the particular stand of juniper that marked the northern boundary, she had stopped being a visitor and started being something else. She did not have a precise word for what she was, not yet, but she was no longer someone passing through. September came with a change in the air, a hint of the mountain's opinion about what was coming, and with it came Henrietta's birthday. She turned 72 on a Saturday in early September, and Vernon had arranged, without fanfare but with considerable logistical effort, a small gathering of the neighbors who had been Henrietta's community for 30 years. The Prescotts came, and the Delgado family from the ranch to the east, and the doctor from Dusty Creek, an earnest young man named Dr. Howell, and Mrs. Morrison, who ran the general store with her husband and was Henrietta's most reliable correspondent on the subject of what was happening in town. Matilda had baked a cake with Rose's guidance, a real cake, a labor of 2 hours, and had pressed wildflowers between the pages of a small leather journal that she gave to Henrietta with a card written in her best hand, telling the old woman simply that being her companion had been, unexpectedly, one of the finest things that had happened to her. Henrietta read the card twice, set it carefully aside, and said briskly, "Don't be sentimental," in a tone that fooled absolutely no one about whether she was moved. It was at this gathering, in the warm, generous atmosphere of an evening full of people who knew each other well, that Patrick Prescott arrived and greeted Matilda with the easy warmth of someone who had enjoyed dancing with her at the barn dance, and retained a general goodwill about the whole encounter. He was charming and uncomplicated and clearly pleased to see her, and he lingered to talk for some time, and she could feel, from across the room, the specific quality of Vernon's awareness of this. She was not playing a game. She had no intention of playing a game, and she did not flirt with Patrick Prescott or encourage anything beyond pleasant conversation. But she noticed that Vernon was aware, and there was something in that awareness that she recognized. Later, when the guests were beginning to take their leave and the evening was winding down, Vernon found a moment to stand beside her while they watched Henrietta say farewell to the Delgados with imperious warmth. "Patrick Prescott is a good man," Vernon said quietly. "He seems to be," Matilda agreed. "He's unattached," Vernon said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the departing guests, his jaw set in a particular way she was learning to read. "That is true of several people," she said carefully. He looked at her then directly with those gray eyes. "Matilda," he said, which was the first time he had used her first name, and it hit her like a hand reaching across a distance. "I need to ask you something, and I need to ask it now because I am finding it increasingly difficult not to." The last of the guests were on the porch. Henrietta had gone inside with Rosa. They were alone in the corner of the parlor, and the lamplight was warm, and the evening air was coming through the open window with the smell of the September sage. "Ask it," she said. "I know I am not a man with a great deal to offer beyond this land and this life," he said. "I know that's not a small thing to accept. This is a hard country, and it is not what you were raised to. I know you didn't come here looking for—" He stopped. "I am making a very poor job of this," he said. "You are doing fine," she said. "Keep going." He took a breath. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you, I think, since the drive back from the Prescott barn dance, or possibly before. I am asking—" He stopped again, and she saw him find the plain words. "Will you marry me, Matilda?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Cincinnati and the train and the $47 and the advertisement in the back of the Enquirer. She thought about her father, who had believed in the careful application of education and patience to all of life's problems. She thought about Henrietta, who had told her that good things should not be allowed to pass you by. She thought about this land, which she had come to love in spite of herself, with its enormous sky and its honest light and its complete indifference to pretense. "Yes," she said, "I will." He was perfectly still for a moment, as though making sure he had heard correctly, and then something happened in his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. All the careful control of him gave way at once, like a dam opening, and he was simply and completely happy, and he took her hands in both of his, and she was certain, more certain than she had been about anything in her adult life, that she had given the right answer. They told Henrietta that night. The old woman was sitting in her chair with a cup of evening tea, and Vernon came in and stood before her and said, "Grandma, I have asked Miss Chandler to marry me, and she has said yes." Henrietta looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Matilda, and her dark eyes were very bright. "Well," she said, "it took you long enough." And then, with a briskness that did not entirely conceal the fact that she was blinking more than usual, she said, "Pour me a proper drink, Vernon. None of this tea business. This calls for something better." Vernon poured 3 glasses of the good whiskey he kept for occasions, and Henrietta raised hers and said, "To sense, finally prevailing," and they all drank. That night, when Vernon had gone out to finish the evening chores and Matilda was helping Henrietta to her room, the old woman stopped in the doorway and took Matilda's hand in both of hers, those small, gnarled, capable hands, and said, "He is the best man I know. I'm not impartial, but I am also not wrong." "I know," Matilda said. "I know he is." "You are good for him," Henrietta said. "He has spent too long alone. You are good for this place. Don't let anyone tell you different." "No one will," Matilda said. Henrietta patted her hand once sharply with finality. "Good night, then," she said, and went in. They were married on a Saturday in October, when the cottonwoods along the creek had turned to gold, and the air had the clean bite of the first autumn cold coming down from the mountains. The ceremony was at the church in Dusty Creek, the one with the broken bell, and the congregation was the assembled ranching community, and the people of the town, a fuller gathering than the small church often saw, because Henrietta Yates had put the word out that her grandson was getting married, and people understood that this was the kind of event you attended. Matilda wore a white dress that Mrs. Morrison had helped her obtain from a dressmaker in Santa Fe, simple but beautifully made, with long sleeves and a high collar and a modest train, and she walked down the aisle of that small church on the arm of Dr. Howell, who was the most appropriate person available to stand in the role, and who performed it with a solemnity that suggested he understood its importance. Vernon was waiting at the front of the church in a dark suit that fit him well and a white shirt that was clearly new, and when she came down the aisle, he looked at her with an expression that she would later describe to herself as the look of a man who cannot believe his luck and intends to honor it every day. It was the best expression she had ever seen on a human face, and it was directed at her, and she held it in her chest like something precious all through the ceremony. The minister, a kind man named Pastor Bell who had been serving the Dusty Creek community for 12 years, read the words that the tradition required, and they said the words that the tradition required. And when it came time to exchange rings, Vernon had a ring for her that had been his grandmother's. Henrietta had given it to him the week before with the observation that it had been her engagement ring, and had sat in a drawer for 48 years, and might as well do what it was made for. And it fit Matilda's hand, as though it had been designed for it. The celebration after was at the ranch, with tables set up outside in the warm fall afternoon, and the ranching community's collective contribution of food and music and goodwill spread across the Yates yard in a way that transformed it into something that looked like abundance. The Prescott boy played fiddle. Domingo, the young hand who had been homesick for Albuquerque, danced with an enthusiasm that made everyone around him happy just to watch. And Vernon danced with his wife. He said the word to himself once, in the pause between two songs, with the particular quality of a man testing whether something is real, and she danced with him and looked up at his face in the lantern light and thought, "I came to New Mexico territory with $47 and a carpet bag held together with a borrowed strap, and this is what I found. This." Henrietta sat in a chair of honor at the edge of the yard, wrapped in a good shawl against the evening chill, and watched the dancing with the expression of someone who has done something they are very satisfied about. She drank 2 glasses of punch and ate a generous slice of cake, and accepted the congratulations of the assembled neighbors with the gracious authority of a woman who has always known this was coming. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and the tables were cleared and the lamps were dimmed, Vernon came and stood before his grandmother's chair and offered her his hand, and she took it, and he helped her inside. She stopped in the doorway and looked back at Matilda, who was standing in the yard in her wedding dress with the stars enormous above her. "Welcome to this family, Matilda," Henrietta said. "It is a better family with you in it." It was the grandest thing Henrietta Yates had ever said to her, delivered with the precise intonation of someone who does not say such things lightly, and Matilda received it as the gift it was. The first year of their marriage was something Matilda had not had the imagination to fully anticipate, which was to say it was harder in some ways and better in others than any preparation could have covered. The life was genuinely difficult. The winters were cold and dry, and the wind came down from the mountains with a force that tested every structure and every constitution, and there was always work, always something that needed doing or fixing or managing. The spring brought floods that took out a section of the south fence and required a week of hard work to address. The summer brought a drought that stressed the water supply and required careful management of the herd. These were not exceptional events, she came to understand. They were simply the conditions of the life. But the life was also, and she could not have anticipated this, profoundly satisfying in a way that was entirely new to her. She was useful here in a way she had not been useful since her father died, and not just to Henrietta, though the companionship continued and deepened and became something she valued as much as anything in her life. She was learning the ranch, learning it in the practical daily sense, learning to ride, with Vernon's patient instruction, well enough to go out with him to check the herd, learning what the land looked like at different seasons and in different weathers, learning the particular character of the mountain light at dawn and dusk, and the specific sound of the wind when weather was coming. She was useful, and she was learning, and she was loved, and those three things together made a life that required very little else. Vernon was a steady presence, consistent in the way that the land itself was consistent, not unchanging, because no person is, but fundamentally reliable, fundamentally himself. She was discovering new angles of him all the time. The dry wit that emerged in private, the generosity that he expressed without drama, the way he watched a sunset on the evenings when the work was done with a quiet that was not emptiness but the opposite of it, a fullness he did not have language for but that she recognized and valued. He told her things, in the gradual accumulating way of people who are genuinely intimate, that she did not think he had told many people before, about the loneliness of the years after his parents died, about the particular isolation of being the only young person who mattered on a working ranch, about the doubts he had sometimes about whether he was running the place well enough or being good enough to the people who depended on him. She listened the way her father had taught her to listen, with full attention, and she said what she thought plainly because he valued plain speaking, and he listened to her in return in the same complete way. And they built, over that first year, the particular structure of a marriage that works, not the one in the novels, all high drama and sweeping declarations, but the one that is made of honest conversations and shared labor, and the capacity to sit in comfortable silence, and the knowledge that the person across from you is genuinely on your side. In the late spring of that second year, when the cottonwoods were leafing out along the creek, and the land was doing its brief spectacular green performance before the summer turned it to gold, Matilda discovered she was pregnant. She told Vernon on a Sunday evening, on the porch, in the long western light. She said it plainly because that was how they said everything, and he was quiet for a moment after, very still, and then he turned to her with a face that had something in it she had never quite seen before, not just happiness but something more layered, something that combined happiness with a kind of reverence, and he took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and said nothing for a long while, and she felt, pressed against his chest, his heart beating fast. "Grandma will say she knew," he said finally into her hair. "Grandma knows everything," Matilda said. "She told me so herself." He laughed, and she felt the laugh go through him, and she thought, this is the right life. This is exactly the right life. They told Henrietta at supper, and Henrietta received the news with an expression of such profound satisfaction that it went beyond words entirely. She looked at Vernon and then at Matilda and then back at Vernon and said, "Your grandfather would be very pleased," which was, coming from Henrietta, an announcement of the highest order of happiness. The pregnancy was not easy. The territory had limited medical resources, and the nearest doctor capable of attending a birth was Dr. Howell in town, who was competent but young, and Matilda navigated the months of it with the particular combination of stubbornness and grace that was becoming her signature. She reduced some of the physical work and increased others, continued reading to Henrietta in the evenings, continued riding in the early months when it was still safe to do so, and continued being honest with Vernon about how she was feeling, which was his firm requirement. She had been raised in a world where women managed their discomforts privately and presented a composed face. Vernon had no patience for this as a domestic policy. "I need to know," he said, early in the pregnancy, with a directness that left no room for argument. "Not so I can fix it necessarily, just so I know." She loved him for this, among many other things. Henrietta's hip worsened somewhat over the winter months as the cold affected it, but her mind remained perfectly sharp, and her opinions remained numerous and emphatic. She had, over the past year and a half, become something that Matilda had not expected when she answered that advertisement. She had become, without fanfare or sentimentality, family. Not a kindly employer, not a benevolent old woman for whom she worked. Family in the bone-deep sense of people who know each other's histories and have chosen mutual loyalty. Matilda loved her, and the love had the quality of the land, durable, unshowy, rooted. The baby arrived on a December morning, early in 1884, with the snow on the mountains and the cold pressing against the windows of the ranch house, and his name was Thomas, after Matilda's father. She had said this once tentatively, expecting to have to argue for it, and Vernon had said immediately and without hesitation, "Yes, Thomas, that's right." She had not been expecting the "that's right" and had to turn her face away for a moment. Thomas Yates arrived in the world with considerable objection to the process, which Dr. Howell managed with capable calm, and with the immediate and alert attention to his surroundings that characterized him through his entire childhood. He was dark-haired like his father and had his mother's eyes, which were hazel and direct, and he was, in the assessment of Henrietta Yates, delivered at her first view of him with the authority of 73 years' experience, perfectly satisfactory in every respect. Vernon held his son for the first time in the afternoon, after Matilda had slept for several hours with Thomas in her arms, and she watched his face and thought she understood exactly what she was seeing. A man discovering a new category of love, the kind that reconfigures everything from the outside in. "Hello," Vernon said to the infant quietly, as though this were a private introduction. "I am your father. I have been looking forward to meeting you." Thomas regarded him with the unfocused gravity of the very newly born. "He is considering you," Matilda said. "I hope he finds me acceptable," Vernon said. "He will," she said. "Give him time." The years that followed were the years of the ranch's life. Thomas grew from a solemn infant into a busy toddler, and then into a boy who followed his father everywhere with the tenacious dedication of someone who considers this person the most important and interesting person in the world, which was an assessment his mother privately shared. He was on his first horse at 3, sitting in front of Vernon's saddle, and he was learning the names of the cattle by 4, and he was asking questions without pause from the moment he learned language was a tool for this purpose. Henrietta told him stories. This was what she did, in the years when her hip limited her more and she was at the house more often. She told Thomas stories about the territory, about the history of the land, about his grandfather and the early years of the ranch, about the world as it had been and as it was becoming. She was a magnificent storyteller, and Thomas was a magnificent audience, and Matilda sometimes sat in the doorway of the parlor and watched them together, the old woman in her chair and the small boy at her feet, and felt the texture of continuity, of people and places and stories going forward. Henrietta Yates died in the autumn of 1886, 2 weeks past her 75th birthday, quietly, in her own bed, in the house she had lived in for 27 years. She did not suffer, and she did not linger in a way that was undignified, which was exactly as she would have chosen. She had been more tired in the weeks before the end, slower in the evenings, and she had spent the last of her sharp energy on Thomas and on Vernon and on Matilda, on the specific investments of love that people make when they understand they are at the end of their account. She had said to Matilda, 3 days before the end, with the simple finality of someone who is done with ceremony, "I brought you here for company. You gave me a family instead. That was better than I asked for." Matilda held her hand and said, "You gave me one too." Henrietta had closed her eyes, satisfied, and they did not discuss it again. The grief was real and it was complete, because Henrietta Yates was the kind of person who leaves a complete-shaped absence when they go. Vernon and Matilda grieved together in the way of people who have developed the habit of meeting each other's interior weather without flinching. And the ranch continued, because it had to and because continuing was what Henrietta would have required of them. And Thomas, at 2 years old, understood more than they expected, and said his great-grandmother's name sometimes in the evenings in a way that suggested he was accounting for her. They buried her next to her husband at the edge of the property, under one of the old cottonwoods, and the stone said, Henrietta Yates, 1811–1886, who held this land and this family together for 50 years and did it without complaint. The years after Henrietta's death were, in a different key, just as full as the years before. The ranch grew. Vernon purchased additional grazing rights from a neighbor who was moving to California, extended the herd to 600 head, hired 3 more permanent hands. The territory was changing around them. The railroad was extending its reach further into New Mexico, and with it came more settlers and more commerce and more of the complicated negotiations that happen when the world that was meets the world that is coming. Some of those negotiations were genuinely difficult. The land south of Dusty Creek had a community of Hispanic families who had worked it for generations before the American territorial system arrived and introduced a new and frequently unjust framework for land ownership. And Matilda, who had been raised by a schoolteacher who believed in the equal application of justice to all human beings, found herself increasingly aware of the ways in which the system that protected the Yates Ranch also pressed against those communities in ways that were unfair. She talked to Vernon about it, and he listened and agreed, and when disputes arose between neighboring properties, he was the kind of man who negotiated rather than litigated, who recognized the legitimacy of long-standing claims even when the territorial system did not, and who used his standing in the local ranching community to argue for fair dealing when he could. It was not a complete remedy. The injustices of the period were structural and deep, and not undone by the good intentions of individual people, and Matilda knew this and was honest with herself about the limits of what was possible. But she also believed, with the stubbornness her father had instilled in her, that individual decency mattered, that it accumulated, that it was not nothing. Vernon's fairness in the local community was known and respected, and it created conditions where some things went better than they might have. In 1887, a second child arrived, a girl this time, whom they named Henrietta without any discussion at all, because the name was simply and obviously right. Henrietta Rose Yates arrived in June in the summer heat, and announced herself to the world with considerably less objection than her brother had, and with an expression, from the first, of serene self-possession that made her grandmother's name feel prophetic. Thomas, at 3, inspected his sister with the thoroughness of a professional appraiser and declared her acceptable, which was so exactly his great-grandmother's word that Vernon had to leave the room briefly. They were, in all the ways that mattered, complete. There was a morning in the autumn of 1888, the cottonwoods gold again along the creek, the air carrying its October bite, the mountains showing their winter white against the enormous blue sky, when Matilda walked out to the corral where Vernon was working with a young horse, and she leaned her arms on the top rail and watched him, and he was exactly himself, concentrated and patient and deliberate, and the morning light was on him and on the horse and on the red-brown land stretching out to the horizon. He noticed her watching after a few minutes and walked the horse over to where she stood. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He studied her face. He had learned to read it the way she had learned to read the weather, with attention and without the necessity of words. "Something on your mind," he said. "I was thinking about the advertisement," she said. "Which advertisement?" "The one in the back of the Cincinnati Enquirer," she said. "In 1882, wanted companion for elderly woman of good standing, room, board, and modest wage." He was quiet, looking at her with that gray gaze. "I answered it because I had $47 and nowhere particular to go," she said. "I came to New Mexico territory to keep an old woman company and read to her in the evenings." She paused. "I did not expect any of the rest of it." "Neither did I," he said. "Are you glad?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, this man who chose his words as carefully as he chose everything, who said things plainly when he said them at all, who had asked her to marry him in a field of broken fence posts and meant every word of it. "Matilda," he said. "This ranch, this land, everything I have, none of it has meant as much to me as the morning you got off that stage coach with your carpet bag and asked the boy on the store steps for directions to the Yates place." He paused. "You are the best thing that has ever come to this ranch, including the 600 cattle." She laughed, and he smiled, that full, rare smile that was, she had always thought, his best feature, which was saying something given the competition, and reached across the rail to take her hand. Behind them, Thomas was crossing the yard with the purposeful stride of a 4-year-old who has somewhere to be, trailed by Domingo's dog, and from inside the house came the sound of Henrietta Rose making her views known about something. The morning was wide and gold and enormous, and the mountain stood at the edge of it like something permanent and indifferent and beautiful. "Come inside for breakfast," she said. "In a minute," he said. "Let me finish with this horse." "I will keep it warm," she said, and walked back toward the house, and felt his gaze on her back as she went, warm and steady and entirely certain. Thomas ran across the yard and grabbed her hand and said, "Mama, the dog ate my boot." And she said, "Which dog and which boot?" with full maternal seriousness, and they went inside together to the warm smell of Rose's cooking and the sound of Henrietta Rose's firm opinions from her cradle, and the morning opened out in front of them like all the other mornings, full and real and entirely their own. They grew older in that land, in the way of people who have committed fully to a place and a life. Matilda learned to love the summer heat, and the winter cold, and the spring floods, and the August thunderstorms that came up fast from the south with their lightning, and their smell of rain on dry earth. She learned to love the particular quality of the light at every season, and the particular character of the creek at different water levels, and the specific calls of the birds that moved through the territory at different times of year. She had carried a schoolteacher's sensibility into this life without planning to, and it expressed itself in ways she had not anticipated. Thomas was reading at 4 and doing figures at 5, because she could not help herself, because the teaching impulse was deeper than intention. There was no school in Dusty Creek that amounted to much, and she found herself increasingly involved in the effort to change that, attending meetings, writing to the territorial government, eventually organizing a small school that met 3 mornings a week in the back room of the church, taught by a young woman named Clara Whitmore, who arrived from Denver in 1890 and was, to Matilda's professional assessment, excellent. Vernon supported all of this with the same uncomplicated generosity with which he supported everything she undertook. He was not a man who considered his wife's activities an extension of himself or a reflection of his own ambitions. He considered them her own business, to be taken seriously on their own terms, and when she needed his help or his opinion or his presence, she asked and he provided, and this arrangement suited them both entirely. The children grew. Thomas was serious and curious, and spent his boyhood learning the ranch from his father with the same devoted attention he had shown from toddlerhood, and also reading everything Matilda put in front of him and several things she did not, and developed at around age 10 an interest in the natural sciences that resulted in a considerable collection of rocks, pressed plants, and preserved insects that occupied 2 shelves in his room and were organized with a precision that was entirely his father's in character. He was going to be something particular when he grew up. What exactly was not yet clear, but it was going to be particular. Henrietta Rose was her great-grandmother's namesake in more than name. She had from very early the specific quality of self-possession that knows its own mind and sees no reason to apologize for this. She was not difficult. She was delightful, in fact, with a warmth and directness that charmed everyone she encountered, but she was entirely herself and had been, apparently, from the beginning. She loved the ranch with the same bone-deep love her father had, and she rode by 5 and helped with the cattle by 7 in ways that were genuine and useful rather than merely decorative. And she asked questions that adults struggled to answer and accepted incomplete answers with a charity that suggested she was working on them independently. There was a summer evening in 1893 when Matilda and Vernon sat together on the porch, the same porch where they had first talked properly, the same stars, the same sounds of the ranch at night, and Thomas was 13 and Henrietta Rose was 6 and both were in bed, and the world was quiet. "Do you ever think about Cincinnati?" Vernon asked her. He asked this occasionally, not with anxiety but with the genuine curiosity of a person who wants to understand all the dimensions of someone he loves. "Sometimes," she said, "I think about my father. I think about his library and the way he read aloud and the things he taught me." She was quiet for a moment. "I do not miss it, I miss him. The missing of him belongs here as much as anywhere." "I am glad you came," he said. "I will say it every year for the rest of my life. I am glad you came." "I know you are," she said. "I am glad I came too." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the old, familiar, comfortable silence of two people who have said most of what needs saying and are content in the saying and the quiet both. The years continued their passage. The territory of New Mexico pressed toward statehood, which would not arrive until 1912, but the transformation was underway in the years of the 1890s, and into the turn of the century, more settlers, more towns, more roads, more connection to the wider world, and less of the raw particular isolation that had characterized the earlier decades. Dusty Creek grew, got a better school and a proper doctor's office and eventually a second church, lost some of its frontier character, and gained some of the character of a settled community, which was a different and not lesser thing. The Yates Ranch endured, which is the word that belongs to it, not merely survived but endured and grew, and became, over the years, something that the community around it thought of as permanent, which is the highest compliment a working ranch can receive. Vernon ran it with the same steady competence and care that he had always brought to it. Matilda was his partner in all of it, not in the sense of the legal and social conventions of the period, which had their limitations, but in the genuine practical sense of two people who run a life together and make all the important decisions by the simple process of talking to each other. In 1901, Thomas left for the University of New Mexico, which had been established in Albuquerque in 1889, to study the natural sciences in a formal setting, and his departure was the complicated kind of grief that belongs to parents who are watching exactly the right thing happen. Vernon drove him to Santa Fe to meet the train, and Thomas shook his father's hand and then embraced him in a way that was brief and fierce and entire, and Matilda kissed him on the forehead as she had since he was an infant, and he was gone, and the ranch was quieter in a way that took some adjustment. Henrietta Rose remained, 17 and more like her great-grandmother every year, the directness, the unshowy competence, the quality of attention. She was talking about school in Santa Fe, about studying to be a teacher, about the things she wanted to do in the world outside the ranch, and Matilda listened to all of this with the complex love of a mother who recognizes her own aspirations in her daughter and wants better for her than her own beginning. "You will go," Matilda told her. "Whatever you want to do, you will go and do it. Your father and I will still be here." "I don't want to leave," Henrietta Rose said, in the honest way of someone who wants two incompatible things simultaneously. "You can come back," Matilda said. "Coming back is only possible if you leave first." Vernon, when Matilda told him about this conversation later, said simply, "She'll go, and she'll come back. She's got the ranch in her the same way Thomas has the science in him. It doesn't go away." He was right, as he usually was about the people he loved. The autumn of 1905 was golden and mild, and the cottonwoods along the creek were spectacular in their yearly gold, and the mountains stood at the western edge of the world in their permanent authority. Thomas came home for a visit from Albuquerque, where he was working as a natural scientist with the Territorial Geological Survey, and had recently become engaged to a young woman named Frances Arroyo, the daughter of an Albuquerque family, who was practical and warm, and who looked at Thomas with the particular expression of someone who has found exactly the person they were looking for. Matilda liked her immediately, and Vernon, after 2 days, declared her good sense well applied, which was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Henrietta Rose came home from Santa Fe, where she had been studying and teaching at a small school, and was, by all accounts, excellent at it, which surprised no one. She arrived with her grandmother's dark eyes and her father's direct gaze and her mother's way of cutting to the center of a thing, and the house was full of people, and full of the specific warmth of a family that has made itself deliberately and maintained itself with care. On the last evening of the visit, they all sat on the porch together, Vernon and Matilda, Thomas and Francis, Henrietta Rose, and the stars came out in their ordinary, extraordinary way, and the creek made its small voice in the dark, and someone said something that made everyone laugh, and the laughter hung in the night air for a moment before dissipating into the darkness and the silence and the particular peace of a place that is fully, in every sense, home. Matilda looked at Vernon, sitting beside her with his arm around her shoulders, gray now at his temples and with the lines of the sun and the years in his face, and she thought about the girl who had come west on a train with $47 and a borrowed strap on her carpet bag, answering an advertisement in the back of a newspaper, carrying nothing more than a schoolteacher's sensibility and a practical determination to make something of whatever she found. She had found Henrietta Yates, who had needed a companion and given her a family. She had found this land, which had needed someone to love it and had taken her love without reservation. She had found Vernon, who had needed nothing, really, who had been complete in himself in the best possible way, but who had, against all apparent probability, been willing to have her beside him, and had done so with a consistency and a depth that was, she thought, the best expression she had ever encountered of what love was actually for. "What are you thinking?" he said quietly, for her ear alone. "I am thinking that I answered the right advertisement," she said. He looked at her with the gray eyes she had loved since the first week, and he said, "You came for Grandma Henrietta." "I did," she said. "And you stayed for me," he said. "I stayed for you," she said. "And for this." All of this. She meant the land and the house and the children and the years and everything that had accumulated between the day she stepped off that stage coach and this evening with the stars coming out and the family around her. He pressed his lips to her temple briefly, warmly. "I am glad you did," he said. "Every day, Matilda, I am glad every day." Thomas was telling Francis something about the geological survey, and Henrietta Rose was asking a question that cut directly to the essential point, and the creek ran in the darkness, and the mountain stood against the stars, and the land that Henrietta Yates had held for 30 years and Vernon Yates held now, and would hold for 30 more, was exactly what it had always been, real and wide and patient, and entirely indifferent to anything but the truth. And the truth was this. A woman had come west as a companion for an old woman, and the old woman's grandson had been there, and he had been everything that mattered, and she had been everything that matched him. And the life they had built together out of $47 and an advertisement and the particular generosity of a sharp-eyed old woman who had known a good thing when she arranged it. That life had been, in every season and in every year, the right one. The stars over the Yates Ranch in New Mexico Territory on an autumn evening in 1905 were exactly the same stars that had always been there, unchanged and indifferent and glorious, and Matilda looked up at them from the porch of the house she had come to as a stranger and stayed in as herself, and she was grateful for every mile and every choice and every good and necessary thing that had brought her here. This was where she belonged. She had known it for years. And the knowing of it after all this time was still the same as it had been the first time, a warmth in the chest, a steadiness in the bones, a certainty as quiet and complete as the land itself. Home.